All right, welcome back. We are starting chapter 6 of the Rathus Introductory Psychology text. So in this video, we're going to be covering the first half of chapter 6, which is on memory, the subject of memory. And before we proceed forward, I would like to sort of um, preface that I would like for you to think about memory as we work through this chapter. As obviously memory, we typically think of memory as like a noun. It's like we have memories. These are a noun. They're things. But I want you to think of memory as a verb, as something that we do um, for the sake of this chapter at different times. Because memory is, yes, we produce memories, which are nouns, but we also, memory is it's a result of a process, a formation process, a very complex process, and to be honest, a process that is not perfect. Uh, our ability to form and remember things and develop memories is not like pushing record on a video camera or a tape recorder, and then later we push play to play it back exactly as it happens. I mean, we literally build memories from the ground up each time we recall them, and each time we recall them, they are somewhat subject to change over time. So you maybe even small changes, but sometimes those small, sometimes it turns into big changes. So again, I want you to understand that yes, memory is a very complex process, but it is also a very flawed process. So let's move forward. By the end of this chapter, these are the things you should be able to accomplish: define memory, the different types of memories, be able to explain the processes of memory. We're going to look at the different types of memory: sensory, short-term, and long-term. Although short-term is actually not what it's referred to anymore. It's called working memory. Short-term is kind of an outdated term, but they're somewhat interchangeable, but actually working memory is probably a better explanation, and I'll explain that when we get there. We'll also look at why we forget, and then we're also going to look at the biological aspects of memory, essentially looking at what parts of the brain and are associated with memory. So let's move forward. So just a review from chapter 5. We looked at learning in chapter 5. So go ahead and let's think about this question before we move into chapter 6. How does punishment differ from reinforcement? And also distinguish between positive and negative punishment, and then give an example of each. So go ahead and pause the video, write some things down, some ideas down, and then come back when you feel like you've got an answer. Okay, welcome back. So really what I'm looking for in terms of response, in terms of punishment versus reinforcement, is how does it affect behavior? Punishment, if it's, punishment if done right, is going to discourage behavior. If a parent spanks their child when they act up in a grocery store, the idea is to discourage the child from acting up in the grocery store. Reinforcement, on the other hand, is meant to encourage behavior. So let's say the child goes to the grocery store and acts nice and acts well and doesn't act out. So the parent buys them a candy bar, and reinforces that behavior. Hey, you went to the grocery store today and you did a good job. Here you go. Here's a candy bar. So that's the difference. One encourages, one discourages. So when we look at punishment, positive and negative punishment, remember in psychology, positive and negative simply means addition and subtraction. So positive punishment would be, I'm going to give you something to discourage your behavior. So maybe it is if you are driving home and you're driving home too fast to get home, you're in a hurry to get home and watch your favorite TV show or watch the Thunder game or whatever, and you get a speeding ticket. The cop gives you a speeding ticket and says, hey, you're driving too fast. I'm going to try to discourage your behavior by giving you a ticket. Negative punishment, having something taken away to discourage your behavior. So let's say, I'm not assuming anybody who's listening to this video would do this, but let's say you just accidentally forgot about that speeding ticket. You let it go. You completely forgot. You stuck it in your glove compartment and completely forgot, for whatever reason, because you're just really busy with school right now and life and other things. So, and then let's say, you get caught up and, hey, you get pulled over again and they say, hey, you never paid that speeding ticket. We're really trying to discourage that behavior. So we're going to temporarily take away your freedom and, we're going to arrest you and take away your freedom. That's negative punishment. We're taking something away. Again, I'm not assuming that anyone in this course would do that, but it's just sort of using both of these positive and negative punishment in the same example. Okay, so maybe you have your own example there, but it should have something to do with addition and subtraction. Okay, let's move into chapter 6. Go ahead and take a look at these true-false items. Go ahead and kind of test yourself. Maybe write down or mentally keep track of which ones you think are true and which one you think are false, and we will proceed and look at each of these questions later on. But you can feel free to pause the video if you'd like. Okay, welcome back. All right, so we are talking about, broadly speaking, when we talk about memory formation, we're talking about two different types of memories. We're talking about explicit or declarative or implicit and non-declarative. So let's take a look at the first one, explicit memories. These are memories of specific or specific information or things that may have happened. And again, it's called declarative memory because it's something that you can clearly state or explain to somebody else. Like if I asked you what you learned in chapter 5 in psychology, you could state or explain it to me verbally, or you could write it out, or you could do something in a way to explicitly state that to me. Down even further, declarative memories, we can break it down to episodic, which is more of like autobiographical memories, things that happen to you personally. So your memory of your 5th birthday party, your memory of graduating high school, your memory of all of these things that have happened to you would be considered episodic memories versus semantic memories, which are just general knowledge. So, the fact that you can remember, Pythagorean theorem still, or what Roy G. Biv means, or, the fact that you remember the stuff from previous chapters in this course, that's just semantic memories that you've built. So, again, we can kind of break, if you're thinking about it as like a tree, we have, or a branching, we have, declarative memory, and then it branches out, to episodic and semantic. So that's explicit or declarative memories. On the other hand, we have implicit and non-declarative memories. And this is essentially muscle memory, just how to do stuff, how to perform a task. It's typically a procedural or a skill. Oftentimes, it's usually some combination of cognitive and physical. And we typically develop procedural memories with lots of practice. I mean, think about the first time you ever drove a car, if you drive a car, that is. I can't assume that everybody drives a car, but, think about if you do drive a car, the first time you drive a car, maybe in driving school or your parents take you out to drive a car, and, it's very difficult. You have to dedicate a lot of cognitive effort to, making sure both hands are on the wheel, your feet are, you got your foot, on the pedal. If you have to learn how to drive with a standard for the first time, this even complicates it, matters more. But, as you continue to drive, and maybe after several years of driving, you can do a lot of those things basically on autopilot as you develop somewhat of an expertise. And again, it's called non-declarative memory because it's things that we do. Yes, you could explain to somebody how you drive a car verbally, but you also could just do it. It's one of those things that we just do. We just eventually develop that kind of muscle memory for, and sometimes even our memory for things like tasks that we do often is kind of primed by by the environment. So you get into your car and you kind of get into that you've driven a car so many times, you kind of go into autopilot sometimes. Think about think about the next time you drive to campus, from your house to campus. If you do that, obviously, if you're taking an online class, or maybe you don't, or but if you're in my intro class in person, you may drive from your home to campus without even thinking about it. You're kind of again in this. As soon as you get in your car, you're kind of primed to drive and get in this kind of mood of driving, and maybe you got your music going, and you're not really, you can kind of tune out. That's kind of what happens when we develop expertise with procedures and our implicit memories. Okay, so truth or fiction. First one: a woman who could not remember who she automatically dialed her mother's number when the police gave her a telephone. Sorry, I gave the answer away. God, I do that so often. I'm so sorry, but the answer is in fact true, because dialing a phone number and remembering the person who you dialed is two different types of memory, which we just talked about. It would be declarative memory to remember who you just called, but actually dialing the phone number is a procedural memory, or an implicit or a non-declarative memory, however you want to describe it. Also, we can divide memory up into two broader categories. We have retrospective, recalling things from the past. This is part of episodic, semantic, implicit memories. When you take a test in this class, you are drawing upon retrospective memories. However, prospective memories, on the other hand, are remembering things to do in the future. So, remembering that, hey, I need to study for my exam coming up is sort of, oh, I've got an exam in the future, so therefore I need to study. That is sort of that is using perspective memory, and there's reasons why that doesn't always work. If you've got a lot on your mind, you're preoccupied with other classes and your job, and maybe you've got kids to take care of and things like that. Maybe you're distracted by life or other things or stresses, that can make that sort of perspective memory, it can make it harder to remember those things. My recommendation is, as a graduate student, I am a big fan of writing lists and making sure, kind of keeping ahead of what I need to know and do each day, because otherwise I do get sort of preoccupied sometimes and kind of forget, what do I need to do in the future? When's this test coming up? When's this paper due? So just a little tip that might help you if you have a lot going on, to kind of help yourself keep organized. So anyways, retrospective is memories of the past. Prospective is kind of things that you got to do in the future. So some different kind of perspective memory tasks, some things that are habit are much more easier to remember. So, for example, like, I've got to go to work tomorrow. That's, a pretty obvious habit task of the future that. There's also event-based tasks that are triggered by events like birthday party, oh, well, someone, my wife's birthday, my wife or my girlfriend or my partner's birthday is coming up. My husband's birthday is coming up. I need to go buy this gift. I need to plan this party, or I need to, do X, Y, and Z. Time-based tasks, these are performed at different times or certain times. These are kind of things that maybe we don't do all the time, but, only under certain times, maybe seasonal things. Again, that's kind of tied a little bit to event-based. Kind of sounds a little bit like event-based tasks, but it's maybe based more on time. Like, hey, we pay our taxes during this particular season right now. This is the time that people are filing their taxes. It's sort of a time-based task that you have to remember. Oh, it's January, I'm going to get my W-2s, and I need to get it turned in by April, because that's what we do in the United States in this time of the year, or at least for adults. If you work and draw a W-2, that's kind of the time-based task that a lot of people are thinking about, perspective memory-wise, at this time of the year. So let's look at some sort of trends in terms of both retrospective and perspective memories. We do notice there is sort of a age-related decline in terms of our memory. I mean, your memory is your ability to remember things is a lot like a roller coaster. It kind of goes up, 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 for a while, as you, probably to your 30s or so, maybe even your 40s, depending on how you, kind of take care of yourself. And then, things kind of start to decline, albeit, again, how you take care of yourself. It can either be just a very steady, slow decline, or it can be a very fast, steep decline if you maybe aren't taking care of yourself cognitively, physically, emotionally, things like that. But it's more so in terms of how fast you process information. That tends to slow down as we age. How fast you can remember things kind of slows down. It's not like the amount of information disappears. It's just it's harder or takes longer to draw upon that information. Some other trends related to our perspective memories, remembering things in the future. It's also affected by things like our mood, our attitude, our emotions, our motivations, things like that impact, how we remember things, things we need to do in the future. If we're very motivated, if we're feeling good, if we have a positive attitude, we're probably more likely to remember things. But if we're kind of down in the dumps, in a poor mood or we're not very motivated, probably the opposite. And there's a lot of research about, people who are depressed, they're less likely to remind themselves, the things they need to do in the future prospectively. Okay, so let's talk about how memories are formed. This is kind of getting into the process or the verb process. When I talk about memory being a verb, it's this process of 3 steps: encoding, storage, and retrieval. And I know this may be somewhat of an outdated way of thinking about this, or maybe an outdated metaphor of thinking about this, but I kind of think about this process to the same way if you were to go out and buy a CD, a physical CD, and you wanted to put it on your phone. You wanted to listen to that piece of music on your mobile device, like your phone or maybe your MP3 player. Again, I know maybe most people nowadays just download it straight to your phone or you stream it, but I think this helps me think about it. So maybe if you're still someone who uses that kind of technology, maybe it'll help you too. So encoding, this is the first stage of the process of developing memory. And this is basically where we are transforming sensory information into something that the brain can process mentally. And again, this is where I think of the CD is, okay, the CD, if you're trying to go from CD to phone, you have to convert it. There has to be some kind of conversion process. So you take the CD and you end up converting it to MP4s or MP3s, excuse me, that will eventually end up on your mobile device. So that's kind of what's going on. Your brain is encoding or transforming sensory information into stimuli that the brain can process. We encode things visually, how they look, also how they sound, and also what their meaning is. So visually, acoustically, and the semantics. These are the ways that we process information. Then we have to store it. Once we encode it, we have to store it. And this is the second stage of information. So it's also this process of kind of maintaining this information over time. We have different types of ways of maintaining information. One way is to simply just kind of repetitively rehearse some information. So, for example, if you're trying to memorize a phone number, again, kind of an outdated thing, like we mostly just put our phone numbers, somebody else types their phone number into our phone for us, or we use Snapchat or some other type of device to contact each other. But if you needed to memorize something, you would typically, an easy way to do it is just rehearse it over and over and over again. But that's a really shallow way of remembering things, and typically isn't like good for long-term storage. But elaborative rehearsal, on the other hand, is much more efficient and much more has much more efficacy in terms of long-term memory, of forming long-term memories. It's trying to tie something you're learning or trying to memorize to something that you already know. It's trying to take something that you're learning or trying to know and elaborate upon it, make it interesting, make it silly, make it funny, make it weird, so that you can't forget it. So it's a much more deeper strategy for trying to develop memories. And this is something I recommend for you that are studying, is try to relate the stuff that you're studying in this class to your own experience and your other classes too. It's much more likely to help you remember these things rather than just remembering it over and over, rehearsing it over and over again. That's just a really shallow way of developing memory. Okay. So let's do a quick comprehension check before we move on. You'll probably need to pause the video after I discuss the question. But describe each of the following types of long-term memory and give an example. So episodic, semantic, and procedural. Go ahead and pause the video, write an example down yourself. Okay, welcome back. Episodic memories could be, it's a memory of something that has happened to you, maybe an autobiographical event, like, hey, when you graduated high school or your first day at college, you could have put something like that down as an example. Semantic memory is just memories of facts. So maybe you put something about, the quadratic equation, or maybe you put something about chemistry, or something like that, some kind of fact or piece of knowledge that you've learned, maybe in school or in life or otherwise. Procedural memory, what you may have put something about muscle memory, memory of how to do things, riding a bike, driving a car, tying your shoes, using a computer program, something like that, something that you do and develop sort of muscle memory over time. Okay, truth or fiction? Learning must be meaningful if we are to remember it. What do you think? True or false? I should have said pause the video. Hopefully you pause the video. If not, it is fiction. It's true, we can remember things even if they aren't necessarily meaningful to us, but my argument would say that is we probably aren't going to remember it well. If we want to remember things well, we need to make it meaningful in some way. It doesn't mean that every little tidbit of piece of information that we're studying or learning needs to be tied to something meaningful, but maybe the overall big picture, we should try to find a way to tie it to something that's relevant to our experiences, because that's how we make personal connections. That's how we really learn something. So the last stage in this process of memory is retrieval. So we've encoded it, we've stored it, and now we need to get it out. It wouldn't make any sense if we stopped here. So we've got the information in the brain, now we need to get it out. So this, again, if we're using the metaphor of the MP3s on our phone or mobile device, this is where we listen to the music. This is where we play it or retrieve it from storage. So it is, we have to, and it is again, this is the process. We have to go back and retrieve information from consciousness, and where it's stored, and return it into our conscious experience. And it is not always an easy process, especially when we're trying to handle a large amount of information or stuff that we don't quite understand. In fact, we can only hold on to so much information in our memory. There is sort of a rule given, there's like a kind of a rule of thumb, plus or 7 plus or minus 2 bits of information. There's a reason why phone numbers are typically 7 digits, if you don't include area codes, because our memory ability to hold on to more information, digits of information, it would exceed most people's, the average person's memory capacity. So it also helps our ability to retrieve information if we have retrieval cues. We'll talk about that more as we go on, but it's important if you kind of leave yourself little breadcrumbs and cues that'll help you draw from memory. And again, we'll talk about some strategies as we go on. So again, memory, if you think about it, memory is this process, it's a verb where we're encoding, storing, and retrieving information. And there are sort of stages where we are developing these memories, sensory, working memory, and long-term. Again, I know it says short-term here, but I'm going to call it working memory, and I'll explain why when we get there. And this is part of a process known as the Atkinson-Shiffrin model it's also called the information processing model, or the Atkinson-Shiffrin model. And here it is here. So we have sensory input from our environment. So in this example, you have people that are talking. Maybe you're at a party and you're talking and somebody tells you their name. You meet this person. Let's say, this is a couple here and they're meeting this, or this is a couple here and they're meeting, it doesn't matter, whoever, whatever scenario you would like. Oh, excuse me. Let's pretend that, I think for the scenario, because it's the thought bubble is above her head. So maybe let's assume these two are a couple right here, and they're talking to this lady who is Linda. So you have the sensory input of the conversation. You have vocalizations going on, and this goes to sensory memory, which we only hold on to information in sensory memory for a very brief amount of time, about a second or two, unless we continue to pay attention. So, if you just come to the party, if this couple comes to the party and they just happen to see Linda, hear her voice, but don't engage her in conversation, don't pay attention, that information is going to disappear very quickly. It's going to decay right here. But obviously they're talking to Linda, so they're paying attention. And obviously maybe one of the first things they say is, oh, well, hello, this is, we are such and such, this is my boyfriend or husband or whatever partner. And Linda responds, hell, my name is Linda. And so we now have this woman who's trying to remember, oh, Linda, that's Linda. I met Linda at the party. Linda in the purple shirt. Linda in the purple vest. She wore a purple shirt and a purple vest. So she's kind of trying to rehearse the information here. It's in working memory here. Now, if she didn't do anything to kind of practice the information, rehearse it, if she didn't try to connect anyway to like Linda with the purple shirt, then that information might be forgotten here. You see, it could decay or displacement. This is why sometimes we forget people's names after we meet them for the first time. We don't make that connection. But maybe it looks like from the thought bubble that this lady is trying to make the connection to Linda. So she's actively trying to store that information now into long-term memory where it's ideally permanent. It's somewhat permanent, albeit that is, we can kind of put air quotes around permanent. Because, even if it gets stored doesn't necessarily mean it can be retrieved. If we don't have the right cues, we could literally forget because we just failed to retrieve it. So again, maybe the next time this couple runs into Linda and they may, hopefully if they have the right cues, maybe Linda's wearing another purple shirt. They go, oh, it's Linda, purple shirt. I met her at Steve's party. That would help them remember. But maybe if Linda has a new haircut and she's wearing a gray shirt or an orange shirt, they may have a tough time remembering the name and retrieving it. So again, this part of the process, this is the working memory part of the process. We store things in long term, retrieve it from long term, and actively use it in working memory here. So that's the entire model in a nutshell, and that's kind of what the next few slides kind of get into. So I'm not going to go over these too long. Sensory memory, again, very short, very brief. Unless we pay attention, information will typically decay at this point. There's different types of sensory memory. There's iconic, which is images. We hold on to things very quickly. Like in our, if you kind of look at something for a minute and then close your eyes, it kind of imprints like a mental image in your mind, but quickly disappears. You can kind of try it for yourself if you just kind of look around the room. Some people have what's known as eidetic memory, where they're able to kind of visually kind of take photographic pictures and keep it into memory and hold on to that information for a very long time. It's a very, I don't want to say it's rare, but it's just not all that common that people have that sort of photographic memory. It also has a lot to do with movement. The way we process information has a lot to do with the saccadic eye movement. A little more information than maybe, I'm not probably going to test you on this, but a little more information. It's how our eyes are kind of always moving and kind of taking mental pictures of things, and that's part of this sort of iconic memory process. Okay, another truth or fiction. If you can see, you have a photographic memory. What do you think? True or false? Pause the video. That is true. Not everybody really utilizes eidetic memory, of really utilizing that photographic memory. Some people are really good about that, but it is possible if you do have a photographic memory, you can do that. Echoic memory, kind of staying within sensory memory. Again, it's holding on to auditory information. Again, sort of sounds after you've heard them kind of resonate maybe in your mind's ear, so to speak. We kind of hold on to those sounds. Like if you heard a ringing bell, even after the bell stops ringing, you might have you might hear that maybe an echo or something mentally, or a song or any kind of sound individually. If you just sort of clap your hands right now, I was going to do it, but I don't want to like startle anybody over the microphone, so I'll refrain. But maybe try it at home and see, kind of listen for that representation of the sound, that echo, maybe afterwards. Short-term memory, also known as working memory. Again, this is we really don't hold on. We can't hold on to information for very long. It says 10 to 12 seconds, but typically it's more like 30 seconds or even a minute sometimes, depending on how motivated we are. But short-term, again, it's now called working memory because we pull information from long-term and we manipulate and we work with that information for a brief period of time, mentally speaking. It's the reason why you can perform mathematics in your head without, there's some mathematics that you can perform without having to write it down or use a calculator, because you're able to pull that information to long term and manipulate it mentally. When we're trying to memorize things, especially when we're trying to draw things into short-term memory, there is some interesting phenomena, especially the serial position effect, where we're more likely to remember things at the beginning or the very end of a series of items. So, for example, if you're in class and if you're doing one of those icebreaker activities and you have to memorize everybody's name, you're more likely to remember the people at the beginning of the line or at the end of the line of people in class, if you had to memorize everybody's name, than the people in the middle. It's just where we kind of focus more attention on. We have more opportunity to rehearse things at the beginning and the end. So be careful of that as you're memorizing or you're studying for things, Don't just focus on the beginning and the end of the chapters. Make sure you're covering the stuff in the middle too. We can, I mentioned that 7 plus or minus 2 earlier, that number for how much information we can store in memory. It helps. We can aid that process by chunking information together, grouping things that are similar together. So, if the numbers for a phone number are, more relevant, for example, like I remember there was pizza places around here in Oklahoma City for a while that used to have like the last 4 numbers of their digits were all 7s or all 0s or all this or that. And so you can chunk that information together. So instead of having to memorize 7 digits, you really only had to memorize 4. You had to memorize the first 3 and then the last 4, which were all the same digits. So that chunking made it easier to remember it than as if it was a phone number with 7 different numbers. Chunking, again, is just helping us memorize. Think about the same thing if you had to memorize a bunch of historical dates, like if you're taking history, a history class, and you needed to memorize a bunch of dates. You could group the ones that are similar together and kind of piece them together similarly instead of trying to remember them all separately. You can read about this familiar grid exercise in your textbook. It's in figure 6.2. Short-term memory, this is why we sometimes why we fail to memorize things if there's some sort of interference during the process of short-term memory, or working memory. Sometimes information will displace, new will displace old will displace new. That's why it's a really good idea to be careful about about how you study. You know, I wouldn't study two similar languages back to back. If you're like a language person, don't study French and Spanish together. You may not want to study history and government close together, you know, because they might interfere with each other potentially. So for the sake of time, you can go ahead and read about this experiment 6.3. I feel like I've just talked a lot about memory, so I want to kind of wrap this up. Long-term memory, this is where we store we store a lot of information. It's somewhat permanent, but not necessarily impermanent, because sometimes we can't accurately retrieve the information. Our perception, our long-term memory is somewhat distorted because of how we see things. They're otherwise known as schemas. Again, we don't just push record and play and see things exactly as they happen. When we draw upon memories from long-term memory, we are seeing them through our own particular lens, how we see the world, our own representation, which could potentially bias that memory, potentially alter the memory, because, you know, we are seeing it from our perspective, not from some other person's perspective. So it is a reconstructive process. Again, go ahead and read about figure 6.4. Read about this interesting experiment in your textbook if you like. It shows how memory has changed. Some people in one group were shown, all two groups in an experiment were shown these four figures, and then the two different groups were given different prompts or different primes to talk about what they remembered from the figures, and depending on the prompt, they saw different things. Like group 1, they were more likely to see eyeglasses, and group 2, they were more likely to see dumbbells. And so you read about that experiment. It's really fascinating, really interesting, but for the sake of time, I'll let you read about that. Truth or fiction, all of our experiences are permanently imprinted on the brain, so the proper stimulus can cause us to remember them exactly. What do you think? True or false? Pause the video. Welcome back. It is in fact fiction. The key word that should have tipped you off is exactly. You know, we do store memories, all of our experiences in our brain, but that does not mean that we get them out. It doesn't mean we even store everything either, too. I mean, there are a lot of experiences that, you know, are so fleeting and so unimportant that we have no reason to memorize them or retrieve them. So just not going to happen. This is the last thing I want to talk about before we go into we wrap up for part 2. Our memories are likely to endure depending on the level of processing and how we process information deeply versus shallow. You know, shallow processing information is just kind of scanning things, maybe just repeating it over and over again just for the sake of repeating it. But it's not really forming connections to it. But deep processing is when we really intend to information, we encode it, we think about it, and we try to relate it to other things that we already know. That is where memories, we can make deep, long-lasting memories that are meaningful and that are much easier to reflect upon and draw upon. So, anyways, this is where we're going to stop. We'll pick up and finish up the second half of memory of chapter 6. We'll start with the comprehension question, and then we'll pick up from there. So stay tuned, and we'll finish up chapter 6.